I'm the Sea Change team leader, and I would also like to warmly welcome our presenters of today, and these are Mr. Julian Barr and Mr. Robbie Gregorowski of ITAD. And later on I will introduce both presenters to you a little bit more in depth. Also we have in our panel Ms. Sang-Lee King, who works for Sea Change on the development of webinars. ITAD works in partnership with public, private and non-government organizations to achieve sustainable development and poverty alleviation. They provide high-quality consultancy services to clients from community to policy level in the UK, which is their base country, and worldwide, to provide the performance of their policies, programs and projects in achieving sustainable development and poverty alleviation. And for more information on these themes and projects that ITAD is working on, please visit their site on www.itad.com. Some of you attendees today might already be Sea Change members and already know about us. But for those who are new to Sea Change, I would like to explain that Sea Change is a community of practice with currently 270 members that develops a culture of high quality, rigorous M&E frameworks, approaches and methodologies for adaptive responses to climate change interventions and practices in Southeast Asia and beyond. And the webinar of today fits that focus very well. Webinars are one way in which we share our knowledge to improve M&E practices. But next to webinars, we also send out a weekly newsletter, maintain a resource library. We support our members in speaking engagements at conferences, and we support them in publishing their work. For more information, I'd like to guide you to our website, which is www.seachangecop.org. A little bit of logistics information for this webinar session. The webinar presentation will take 30 to 35 minutes, after which there will be time for questions and answers. You can type your questions in the question field in the software, after which we will present the questions to our presenter. Or you can raise your hand and ask the question verbally. On the next slide, I will show you where you can find the question field and the hand raising button. Any questions that have not been answered during the 30-minute Q&A session will be answered offline and published on our website, together with the recording of the webinar. For the Q&A session, during the Q&A, please click on the little raise hand icon if you would like to ask the question by voice, or simply type the question in the question window. I have to say that most people like to use the question window because it's the quickest. And as I said, any questions that cannot be answered within the 30 minutes will later on be answered by the presenters and will be put on our website. As a last part of this introduction, please let me now introduce to you our presenters of today, Mr. Julian Barr and Mr. Robbie Gregorowski. Julian is the ITAD director, an expert evaluator. He is currently leading the evaluation of the Rockefeller Foundation's Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, called ACERN, and he has particular expertise in monitoring and evaluation of systems design, governance, and research management and communication. Apart from that, Julian is also on the advisory board of the Sea Change Community of Practice. Robbie is a principal consultant and evaluator at ITAD and leads their climate change M&E work. He has recently provided climate change M&E services to DFID's Climate and Development Knowledge Network, called CDKN. He also reviewed CARE International's Climate Change Strategic Plan, and the CARE Climate Change portal can be found through the following link. And recently he evaluated the UN ISDR disaster risk reduction knowledge portal, which you can find here through preventionweb.net. At this point, it's not yet questions and answers. At this point, I'll be handing over to Julian and Robbie to start with their presentation. Thank you.
Dennis, thank you very much for that very thorough introduction, and hello to all the participants. Thank you very much for staying around. I understand it's the end of the day in Southeast Asia. We're just in the middle of the morning here, so thank you to everyone for staying on towards the end of the day to listen to us. Robbie and I gave a very similar presentation as part of the UNICEF My M&E series of webinars a couple of weeks ago, but that was done at a time that would have been the middle of the night in Asia. And given the relevance of the topic for sea change, we discussed with Dennis and thought it would be worth doing another specific webinar for the sea change members. So welcome to everyone. The outline of our talk, we'd like to cover 5 topics. We'd start with just outlining the nature of climate change interventions. We will then talk about excluded populations, and the idea of looking at excluded populations particularly came from discussion with UNICEF when we gave this webinar as part of their series, because their series is about equity-focused evaluations and excluded populations, and there's an important link with climate change. We will then have a look at the challenges for evaluating climate change, the particular problems that it faces, then how that's currently being addressed through a number of different evaluation frameworks that have been developed for looking at climate change. And finally, we will discuss the remaining challenges, or the most important remaining challenges in trying to evaluate climate change. I should say that when we previously gave this webinar, we were giving it to a UNICEF audience of evaluators. And therefore we spent some time discussing the nature of climate change with an audience that was really evaluation professionals rather than climate change professionals. My understanding of the sea change audience is that there are a mixture of climate change professionals and evaluation professionals, with some people in the middle who have expertise in both. So forgive us if we sort of cover ground that you're very familiar with, but we wanted to cover all bases. So the International Panel on Climate Change identifies 2 main responses to climate change. It distinguishes between mitigation and adaptation. And there's a paper that was produced by Steer and Van Storch, which has a very nice description to identify the differences between mitigation and adaptation. And they say that mitigation are the activities that protect nature from society, while adaptation is the way that society protects itself from nature. Essentially, mitigation is ways that we can try and reduce the sources or increase the sinks for greenhouse gases, while adaptation is trying to adapt natural and human systems to a changing environment, in this context particularly changes that are stimulated by climate change. Our focus is going to be very much on adaptation, so how human systems can respond to climate change and evaluating that. There's been other work, and Sea Change has presented other work focusing on mitigation and how we can reduce greenhouse gases. This is looking much more how humans and human systems can adapt to climate change. Climate change adaptation shares quite a lot of common ground with disaster risk reduction. which many people are familiar with. And certainly when we evaluated the Rockefeller Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, a lot of the cities within that network were familiar with disaster risk reduction as an entry point for climate change, as they had had to cope with climate change and riverine floods and other sudden climate-related events, floods, cyclones, those sorts of things. What disaster risk reduction is less good at dealing with is the slow onset climate change related events, slow sea level rise, subtly changing rainfall patterns, the increase on drought. And adaptation covers both adaptation to the sudden onset events and the slow onset events. We'd also like to identify this area which I think is becoming increasingly important, which is climate change resilience. And resilience is about the capacity of people and systems, the capacity of society to respond to climate change while continuing to function normally. And essentially climate change resilience could be thought of as adaptive capacity. It's about the ability and the capacity of a system to continue changing, continue adapting, continue responding to changes in climate. So we're going to talk about how to evaluate adaptation and resilience to climate change. And if we look at work that's been done by the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, IIED, they've very helpfully identified different categories of adaptation. And we can see this almost as a continuum from the traditional focus on livelihoods, which is essentially addressing the adaptation deficit, and that can be seen as keeping development on track. How can we adapt livelihoods to continue to deliver human development outcomes in the face of climate change? And we can see this as what's traditionally been called coping strategies or building climate resilience. Then we can see sort of at the next level is adaptation to incremental climate changes, and that can be called climate proofing. And we can see a lot of this is to do with systems adaptation, improving drainage systems to cope with increased rainfall intensity, adapting cropping systems to deal with longer or shorter cropping periods. And then finally, we have a type of adaptation which we would call transformational change. And this is really sort of identifying the point at which you get beyond the ability to continue to cope with climate change or the ability to proof your system from climate change, and you need to have some sort of fairly large-scale transformation, which might be just resettlement to areas which are less climate change prone, or it might be an entire transformation in an agricultural system, moving from trying to produce crops in a low and increasingly lower rainfall situation, and accept the fact that pastoralism is the only agricultural system that's suitable to a new climate regime. And this transformational change is a subtext to our presentation, and one of the things is trying to evaluate what is the point at which people need to be thinking about transformational change rather than continuing to try and face it through strategy, which in fact are reasons of not being able to cope. And then finally, to set the sort of the other piece of our the framework of our talk is to discuss excluded populations. And in climate change, we're seeing excluded populations as those who are most vulnerable to climate-related shocks and stresses. They're most susceptible to or unable to cope with the adverse effects of climate change, and therefore they have what we call a low adaptive capacity and therefore a low resilience. And that's both a low adaptive capacity as individuals, as households, and a low adaptive capacity of community and society. So we can see groups who are vulnerable. And those groups of ability to cope with climate change, to be resilient from climate change, is also affected by the institutional and policy environment in the country. So individual resilience can be helped if it's in a institutional and policy environment which is taking climate change seriously. So we can see there are two dimensions there. There's the sort of the lower level household resilience and the higher level enabling environment around policies and institutions, and both of those things together define adaptive capacity, and we're going to come back to that. The other thing we would say is that generally climate vulnerability and poverty are closely linked, that areas of high vulnerability also tend to be areas of high poverty. The poor people have a low asset base and they tend to live in places which are physically exposed to actual or predicted climate risks. We would also then see some dimensions of gender, age, and ethnic minority, and those also tend to be groups who have a higher climate vulnerability. And then finally, to say that climate vulnerability is not just about climate-related risks, that other factors can increase the vulnerability to climate. And just to illustrate, this is some work that was done by the International Livestock Research Institute in Africa. And they looked at predicted change in the length of cropping season in sub-Saharan Africa from a baseline of 2000 up until 2050. And you can see that in the pink and red areas, cropping season is predicted to reduce by anything up to 150 days. So the ability to grow rain-fed crops is going to be severely limited in those areas. I haven't actually overlaid onto it, but an overlay of poverty would map very strongly onto this prediction of reduced cropping season, and therefore you can see that vulnerability to climate change and poverty are closely linked, and sort of unless we are able to deal with it, I like to go into a vicious cycle of increased poverty, increased vulnerability, more poverty, more vulnerability. So we need to consider both the poverty and human development aspects as well as vulnerability. Looking at how people have approached climate change evaluation, we see that there are two main frameworks that have been used. One is looking at the capacity of government and institutions to adapt to and respond to climate change, and in the evaluation terms we can look at things about whether policies for climate change and climate change adaptation exist, and whether governments are putting up the mechanisms in place that help people understand and respond to climate change. There's a second approach which is much more about keeping development on track. Are governments still helping people develop and reduce poverty? And that work tends to look at adaptive capacity and development outcomes. And traditionally, these two approaches have been quite separate, and the reality is most evaluations of climate change have tended to look more at one of these approaches than the other. And the thesis of our presentation is that these two things need to be looked at together. And before we start to look at frameworks, I'd just like to give you this slide, which identifies the key challenges in dealing with evaluating climate change adaptation. The first challenge is timescale disconnects. Climate change, particularly the slow onset climate risks, are happening over a longer timescale, whereas we're trying to evaluate projects which are working on a 3 to 5 year timescale. And the difficulty is that projects are unlikely to have major impact on climate change adaptation within that time frame. So what can we do within the results chain to try and identify changes in a shorter timescale? We also recognise that in the sort of policy and environment part of climate change adaptation, that we're looking at political commitments which may or may not occur within the sort of 5 year political timescale, which is clearly much shorter than the climate timescale. A particular feature of climate change is a declining baseline. We're trying to evaluate something where the quality of the where the baseline situation is declining. So the the nature of climate risks is increasing over time. So our starting point gives us an unrealistic starting point if we recognise that the baseline is reducing all the time. So the situation, the do-nothing situation, is that people are going to be getting more and more affected by climate change. So when evaluating it, we somehow need to normalise for that increasing vulnerability if we're going to be able to detect any project effects. We're also in a very uncertain environment. Climate change predictions, climate change science are still not very reliable, particularly at a local scale and to some extent at a national scale. So the effect of climate change is quite uncertain, and we're trying to evaluate against an uncertain future. We also need in our evaluation to be able to pick up unintended consequences. Unintended consequences are always a feature of evaluations, but the particular feature of climate change is maladaptation. People can try and respond to climate change, but some of the things they do actually might make the effect of climate change worse. And a particular example that we've come across in Bangladesh is where people are putting roads on embankments to lift them out of the increased flooding, but the embankments that they build don't have enough drainage channels underneath them, drainage pipes underneath them, so the embankments actually impound the flood worse and exacerbate the effect. So we need to be very aware of picking up these maladaptation effects. And then finally, a lot of evaluations tend to focus on the short cycle adaptation, so looking at coping strategies and climate proofing, rather than really asking the big question of whether systems should be transforming to respond to climate change. So there's a set of quite distinct problems around trying to evaluate climate change. What I'd like to do now is to hand over to my colleague Robbie, who will run you through some key frameworks that have been developed to try and do climate change evaluation. Robbie.
Thanks, Julian, and welcome everybody from Sea Change. I would just like to run through three approaches or frameworks. I won't go into them in any detail, but to introduce some of the methods or tools that people are coming up with in what is quite a rapidly emerging field to address some of these challenges, either to bring the upstream and the downstream together, or to address some of these challenges such as declining baselines and ensuring that the climate vulnerable poor are put front and centre. You'll probably be able to notice a sense of an evolution as these approaches have fed off each other and have developed over the years, starting with a UNDP framework which was developed in 2008, and then I will talk very briefly about a tool or an approach developed by the Strengthening Climate Resilience Consortium by Paula Silva Villanueva, who I know is a Sea Change COP member and somebody who we've worked with on a couple of jobs. And then finally I'll introduce an IED model for tracking adaptation, measuring development, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. It's been quite influential here in the UK for DFID and that sort of thing, developed by Nick Brooks in London. So, firstly, there's the UNDP framework, which, as you can see from the diagram, looks at the sector level. Again, this sort of is reflective of thinking back in 2008. The reason I think it's a nice starting point is that it includes a number of the key features of climate change adaptation M&E. The first is that there's a recognition that climate change adaptation is complex and involves interventions that cut across many sectors and are implemented at many different scales. Hence the need to sort of mainstream climate change into development interventions and across multiple thematic areas, and that's shown on the left-hand side there with the overlap between the sectors: food security, water, health, and so on. The second part is that it recognises that successful adaptation processes involve more than simply relabeling livelihoods, programming or practices, but also involve a set of softer activities at different scales again, such as policy and planning. Capacity building is a key one, and as well as at the bottom the practices and the livelihoods and the resource management. And then finally, what I like about this framework is it introduces a number of indicator types, or starts thinking about indicators of climate change adaptation. And these need to combine sort of standard development or vulnerability indicators, as well as indicators, as are shown there, of coverage, of impact, of sustainability and replicability. And so this is looking at adaptation from a sectoral level, or what we've previously said is upstream. Perhaps what is missing here is a more nuanced sense of what adaptive capacity means for different groups, individuals, households, or groups within society. Now, if we move on to the first slide of 2 on the SCR Consortium adaptation framework, this is looking much more at the level of livelihoods and level of communities and households. So we're specifically looking into bring the climate vulnerable poor into adaptation now. And the point to make from this is that Paula Silva Villanueva and her colleagues think that we need a more holistic and flexible approach to gain a deeper understanding of the determinants that enable and constrain adaptation. So rather than focusing on results, which is what traditional sort of more sector level M&E has done, which focuses sort of the delivery of adaptation interventions, we need to look more at processes and process-based indicators to understand cause and effect relationships. So, and the second point they make here is that M&E has a key role to play in learning about how and why interventions or practices to strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability are working. So there's a key learning objective or role to be played by M&E. It's not simply a monitoring function. The framework here is based in looking at taking this holistic view. Looks at first the sort of the context, so the disaster risks and the uncertainties, and a good understanding of those, and then what that means for the adaptive capacity. So the ability of people, organisations, and networks to experiment and innovate is the first of their components of adaptive capacity. And then finally, the framework looks at the structural causes or drivers of poverty and vulnerability. And in this way, the framework aims to address some of the challenges we set out earlier. In particular, at this sort of level of households and communities, they also start to think about some development or some components of indicators of adaptive capacity. And so, and they come up with a framework of questions and indicators, which it's very hard to see there. I know this paper is available on the Sea Change in the library. They also look at what would some principles or components of indicators of adaptive capacity look like. So they'd be adaptive. They reflect the possibility of changing conditions. So we're talking again about this long-term perspective with transformative change. Dynamic, they would capture the way processes are changing. Capture actions rather than states. So we're not looking sort of before and after, but we're looking at sort of ongoing changes. Participatory, obviously that goes sort of without saying when we're looking at M&E of excluded populations. And thorough, so you're looking to, as Julian mentioned, identify any potential maladaptation early on. Now, how can we pull the two together? The UNDP looked more at the sector level, and the We Adapt looked more at communities and households and that sort of thing. Well, an attempt has been made by IIED, by Nick Brooks and his colleagues, and it's illustrated in the diagram you see there. So you're seeing the top-down or upstream climate risk management taking place at the level of global and national institutions, policymakers, and capacity, particularly capacity at that level, and then from the bottom up, you've got a development performance perspective. So what's happening at the level of households and communities in terms of adaptation interventions and how they are impacting on people's development, keeping development on track, but also reducing their vulnerability to the risks posed by climate change. So they have produced a framework that tries to integrate both the sort of the sectoral level or climate risk management at the national and international level, and a sort of bottom-up communities and households. We'll come back to this framework in a second and talk about it in a bit more detail, but I just want to hand back to Julian to illustrate this point about the integration of sectors and development performance at the grassroots.
Thanks, Robbie. Just to illustrate, we wanted to use the Rockefeller Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network to show the idea of the downstream, the track one the upstream climate risk management work, and combining it with the downstream development performance idea. And this is the theory of change from the ACERN program. The slide will be available after the webinar, so you can look at it in more detail. But essentially, the program has four outcomes. The fourth outcome is just an internal one about effectively managing the program. So the first three are the important ones, and you can see that they're essentially about cities and cities' capacity, cities' understanding, and cities' response to urban climate change. So these are very much the upstream climate risk management part of our two triangles diagram. If we then move over to the right hand side and look at the impact, you can see the impact has two dimensions. There's a dimension which is about resilience and capacity of a growing number of Asian cities, and the second part which is about improving the lives of poor and vulnerable people. So in the impact we have both concepts. We have both the upstream cities work and the downstream communities and people bit, but what we discovered in the evaluation is that the program is doing little directly on the implementation side, which will immediately affect the downstream people and community side of it, and therefore it was difficult for the evaluation to find anything out about development outcomes. And a key recommendation was therefore that the program should adjust its monitoring, so it's collecting monitoring data about development outcomes, and so the program has done that as a response to our evaluation. So it was a useful lens to think about how the program is working. I'll hand back to Robbie to talk about how we think we might be able to link these extremes, the upstream and the downstream.
Okay, so where are we now? I previously introduced the framework introduced by IED of sort of upstream and downstream. We believe that there's still potentially a missing middle or something that is required between the two to link upstream and downstream. Could be potentially indicators of adaptive capacity, and here we're broadly talking about a broader interpretation of adaptive capacity, so not just looking at households and individuals, but also the adaptive capacity of society and communities. So our belief is that combining upstream climate risk management and downstream development outcomes requires these indicators of adaptive capacity at society, community, household and individual level. It's only through collective societal action to bring about the transformative change required that climate change adaptation will be successful. And this ultimately comes down to adaptive capacity at all levels, and not a dichotomy between what's going on at the climate risk management level at the top and what's going on in terms of development outcomes at the bottom. Now, if you wanted to translate this sort of our thinking into a narrative or a theory of change, it would be something along the lines of climate change adaptation is complex and operating across multiple scales, sectors, and involving multiple processes. The monitoring and evaluation of adaptation revolves around how best to bring in the people at all levels. The one uniting factor is adaptive capacity for society, institutions, communities, households and individuals. So we see indicators of adaptive capacity in this broader framing of adaptive capacity as the glue that can potentially link the upstream and the downstream. Now, I must say this is a personal view of Julian and I, and a reflection of where we think there is currently a gap. It is very early days, and we'd appreciate people's thoughts and feedback, and we think it's a sort of part of the role of Sea Change and communities of practice to develop this thinking. This is where we are going. I won't go into particular detail, but there are, in terms of possible indicators of adaptive capacity, I think we have a fairly good idea of what adaptive capacity would look like at the household and community level, and Paola and the Strengthening Climate Resilience Consortium have done some great work there. But indicators of adaptive capacity slightly higher in the middle, and moving up to the level of policy and planners may involve things such as, or indicators of recognition of the need to promote diversity, the ability to create flexible and effective institutions, adopting multiple level perspectives, integrating uncertainty, so integrating a longer time horizon, and the recognition of the need for transformative change is key to any indicator of adaptive capacity in the middle here. For looking at these indicators, and based on what I've said, I think it's certainly apparent that many of the characteristics are relevant, applicable across many stakeholders and across scales and across sectors. And that's where we see a role for these indicators of adaptive capacity. And in other words, that society as a whole is building adaptive capacity. We need indicators of that. And so I don't think I'll go into any more detail. I have found an interesting or very useful definition of adaptive capacity, which sort of reflects this and reflects this thinking. And again, it's developed by Nick Brooks and his colleagues at IED, and it calls it, or defines adaptive capacity as capacity and preparedness to confront longer-term adaptation issues at the institutional level, and flexible and resilient systems, institutions, and governance that allow societies to respond to climate change and to uncertain and evolving risks. And I think that that nicely summarizes our conceptualization of adaptive capacity and how it can play a role linking the upstream and the downstream. I'll now hand back to Julian just to wrap up with some lessons and where we think we could go with this.
Thanks, Robbie. We've got two final slides to finish. So what are the lessons for evaluation from this analysis of the current thinking on evaluation frameworks? Well, all three of those frameworks to some extent combine top-up and top-down and bottom-up approaches. Some of them are more focused on one than the other, but we clearly need to link the integration of climate change into policies and institutions with actions at the lower level with the household and community, and those two spheres can often be taken separately, and our evaluations need to combine them. So we shouldn't separate the two streams. We need to think about what is this missing middle and how we can close it, and close it through considering adaptive capacity. But it's adaptive capacity at a number of levels. As Robbie said, it's adaptive capacity of society as a whole, and that's expressed at the household level, at the community level, and at higher levels. And when thinking about how we can evaluate adaptive capacity, we would see that a knowledge attitudes practice paradigm is quite useful. What people know affects the way that they think about things, and the way that they think about things affects the way that they behave. And so there is quite a lot of work in climate change at the moment in terms of improving people's understanding and awareness of the problem, but that needs to be tracked through to their attitudes to climate change. Are they individually climate deniers, for example, and then ultimately how they behave. And that needs to be quite a sophisticated analysis, because a lot of the narrative on climate change at the moment focuses on trying to get practices around coping and climate proofing, and we need to understand whether people realize there's a tipping point at which they might need to have transformational change in their livelihood systems, in their environmental management systems, because climate change has got to such a point that it's no longer possible to cope with or climate proof. So that's the sort of the essence of our thinking from this analysis of the frameworks. Unfortunately, that doesn't solve the problem. There are still quite a lot of challenges in climate change evaluation, and we think that the frameworks need to continue to develop in a number of different ways. The approaches need to be much better at joining the upstream and the downstream, and we've offered this approach through adaptive capacity. Those indicators of adaptive capacity need to be further developed. Thinking back to excluded populations and equity-focused evaluations, it's important that our evaluations are able to understand the relationships between adaptation and equity, and that adaptation is not just a zero-sum game, in that wealthier groups are more adapted to climate change at the expense of poorer people who become more and more vulnerable. So we can see situations where wealthier people may move onto higher land or build their houses on raised ground, leaving vulnerable people to be more flooded. So we need to think about this interplay between poverty and adaptation. We think there's a very useful area of work which could explore existing indicator frameworks, such as the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, which has now been around for 15 or 20 years, which clarify the relationships between the determinants of adaptive capacity, particularly looking at human development, physical assets, social capital, and the results chain. And finally, we think that M&E has an important role to play in empowering populations, empowering people on the downstream side of the diagram. M&E can provide a link between the policy and institutional environment and the development aspects, creating a feedback loop between those to make sure that we get better policy and better institutional responses to climate change for excluded populations. So with that, I'd like to hand the presentation back to Dennis. If you'd like to take over again, Dennis. Thank you very much. We're standing by.
Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. Also very clear. I can see that you did it 2 weeks ago. You had a bit of practice here in presenting for a webinar.
2 weeks ago, you had a bit of practice here in presenting for a webinar.
We will now go to the question and answer moment. If anyone has questions, please type them in the question and answer field.
If anyone has questions, please type them in the question and answer field.
And I would like to ask Robbie and Julian to turn down the volume a little bit because I hear myself echoing.
Robbie and Julian to turn down the volume a little bit because I hear myself echoing. Is that better?
Let me see. Yeah, that's better. Thank you. A first question.
Yeah, that's better.
The first question is from, well, it's not that much better. Could you turn it down a little bit more?
Well, it's not that much better. Could you turn it down a little bit more? You'll be very low now, but I think we can cope.
Okay. The first question is from Kadir. And this question is about the use of the word excluded population. The question is there a certain threshold, or how do you define or measure what is most vulnerable? How do you what makes an excluded population?
So what the question is, what is there a threshold for what makes what is vulnerable?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do we want to take the questions one by one, or should we take them in batches?
Do take them one by one.
Okay. Sorry, Dennis, have we got the open mic now, or is it?
You do.
Okay, thank you. I think that's very much context specific. Obviously we have a number of measures, global measures of poverty, and we have the $1 a day and $2 a day metric on what's poverty. But I think vulnerability is going to be different in different places, and that's partly in response to the nature of the climate risks to which people are vulnerable. So I think if the work which was done as part of the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, the Rockefeller Programme, the 4 countries and 10 cities in which that program was working did vulnerability assessments for the cities as part of developing approaches to climate resilience, and those we found quite useful for our evaluation, and particularly work which a group called Taru in India have done was looking at a number of facets of vulnerability, and sort of taking something which is a bit like the asset pentagon in the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, for those of you who are familiar to it. And it's looking at a combination of physical vulnerability, so where are households located in relation to, in this example, flood risk, what level of education do households have, and what access to households have to financial resources. And a mix of those 3 things was really the determinant of vulnerability. And where you set that on the scale in terms of how much financial resource is important for being resilient, how much education is important for resilience, and sort of how far above the average flood height is important for resilience, really depends on where you are. But I think it's a combination of a number of factors which can then be calibrated for individual locations.
Thank you. A second question is from Zorika. Excellent presentation is a comment. And the question is, would you have examples about evaluating climate change in refugee settlement areas? Have either one of the 2 of you been involved in that?
I'm afraid we haven't done it. One of my colleagues did his PhD on livelihoods of Mozambique refugees in refugee camps in Malawi, but that was sort of really predated real big thinking on climate change. So we don't have any direct experience ourselves. And so I'm not sure sort of what in terms of vulnerability, what would be the sort of the key asset base, because obviously we're looking at populations with very, very little, and so that in from first principles they would seem to be very vulnerable people, and so I think it would also be the 2 triangles approach would be important here. It would be what are the resources that the individuals have, but also what is it that the camp and that those running the camp have in terms of institutions and policies in place to help people adapt, and thinking longer term, how long are these people likely to be refugees? Are they there for the foreseeable future? And if they're going to return somewhere else, then what are the climate factors for wherever they're returning to? And sort of interestingly, just to add, we're now starting to sort of think about a new classification of refugees, people who are climate refugees. And if we look at some of the low islands in the Pacific, countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu, those countries are starting to look at abandoning their land completely and emigrating to Fiji and buying high land in Fiji, and the whole country would become climate refugees. So there are some very interesting dimensions to that question. I'm afraid we don't have direct experience ourselves.
Okay, understandable. You can't have experience in every single sectoral field in this line of work, and I don't have any experience in it either. So I'm afraid that I'll have to leave it at that as well. I wouldn't have any examples myself. A question by Yankee is how to differentiate between the actions taken as adaptation or the ones that are a normal response to other socio-economical issues.
I think this is one of the areas where I think we see, or certainly I've felt that climate M&E frameworks need to be a bit smarter. Lots of the indicators, or traditional thinking has been around using standard development indicators and adapting them for climate change, and I felt that we need to work a bit harder than that to develop some more specific indicators of adaptive capacity, because I think you're right, there may be a problem differentiating between sort of climate change adaptation and or just traditional response to other risks and threats in the environment. I'm not sure if that really answers the question. The other point to make is that there has been a drive recently that I'm sure lots of people are aware of to rather than approach climate change as a separate sector, to mainstream it particularly into areas where it overlaps. So mainstreaming climate change into disaster risk reduction approaches, mainstreaming it into food security approaches and that sort of thing. So rather than seeing climate responses as distinct and standalone, better integrating them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answers the question particularly, but perhaps Julian's got something to add.
I think it's an important question, and sort of one of our concerns has been that development is quite a sort of a modish business. It changes fashions regularly, and one of our concerns is that the sort of work that people have traditionally been doing is now just being rebadged as climate change work. So work that we would have seen as just ordinary development work a few years ago, people are now doing the same thing but calling it climate change. And the concern there is that sort of there's a lot of new money being made available for response to climate change. And that if there's this sort of a porosity between climate change money and development money, that actually it means that donors might be investing less in development per se because they're expecting it to come from climate money. So I think it is an issue that we need to keep an eye on, certainly.
Let me see. I have a question from Vladimir here. I'm not sure it's actually a question, but it's an interesting comment he makes here. He says it was a very interesting presentation, and I did learn some new things. But maybe it's my mood today. But more and more literature I consult looks at adaptation as a scientific discussion. But in the end of the day, it's what we have to do to react to climate vulnerability issues. So the comment he makes is that it's not that much about the whole scientific discussion, but it's more about how to scale and how to work on vulnerability issues. Would you have that same feeling that it becomes a bit of a scientific discussion these days?
I think there is a big scientific discussion, and obviously the IPCC is going to be producing AR5 shortly, and certainly in the UK here we're very familiar with a lot of controversy around the science discussion on climate change because of what they called ClimateGate, when there was a large leak of emails about the climate change science from the University of East Anglia. And I think as a consequence of that, what counts as valid evidence in going into the IPCC's AR5 has become much more rigorous. So sort of there is a push on much more rigorous science going into the science debate. How that then sort of downplays to sort of what Vladimir is talking about at the local level, I think is important, and we've seen some different approaches to it. And one of the I think problems coming from a traditional planning paradigm is expecting to have very solid climate prediction data to say that in village X or in town Y that climate change means that we're going to have an extra 100 mils of rainfall in June and July, and that the temperature is going to increase by 7 degrees, and therefore we can work out a very clear-cut scientific response to climate change. And certainly work that we've done in Asia, we've seen we've seen planners really torturing climate data to try and downscale the predictions to give them something which they think they can plan around. But really, that's a false hope that the precision in climate data isn't that good, and climate prediction is using the world's largest supercomputers, and it's still not getting us that level of precision which planners would like. So that's why we think the sort of the resilience and adaptive capacity is such an important approach, because with what we're testing there is not how well people have responded to specific predictions about scientific predictions about rainfall and flood and all of those sorts of things, but actually are people able to respond to change? Just straightforward change? Have people got the knowledge and the ability to be flexible, to understand what change is happening in the external physical environment and know how to respond to it? And it goes back to that classic saying from the 60s, you know, if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for the day, but if you teach him to fish, he'll eat forever. And it's not sort of saying to people, you need to adopt this new rice variety to adapt to climate change. It's giving people the ability to understand how they need to adapt their farming system, or whether they need to stop being farmers and become fishermen in response to climate change. So what we would really be looking for is that in that individual, that household, that community adaptiveness, that understanding of when and how to adapt, rather than just picking up the latest scientific fix, because climate change is so unpredictable. So I think it is a very useful observation from Vladimir, and we certainly like that resilience approach, and we're seeing it coming through much more in sort of the way that governments are talking about climate change. It's about being resilient to change rather than adapting to change.
I think you touched upon a very important point there, and with
Dennis.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jen, it's Robin now. Just to add, I think one of the sort of points that was sort of a subtext to our presentation is that nobody's saying that you shouldn't be doing the sort of technocratic adaptation that's going on in projects and programs around the world. But I think ultimately what we're saying is, how will we know if we're getting it right, if we're managing to adapt to the long term, the scale and the extent of the long term threat? And that comes down to societal notions of firstly understanding the magnitude of the threat, and then beginning to think of solutions. And so that's where we're talking about sort of adaptive capacity is sort of at the higher level upstream, being a mechanism by which we can integrate what we're doing at the ground level into societal notions. We won't address the huge risks and threats simply by technocratic programming on the ground. It requires significant resources. People need to, there's a mindset change that's required in terms of climate planners and those sorts of things, and that is around a joined up conceptualization of adaptive capacity, I think. So for example, although, and I think it links across lots of the questions we've been asked about, who are the vulnerable populations. Well, I think people need to, in particularly what we've been thinking about in cities like Dhaka and places like that, is although they don't consider themselves the climate vulnerable poor, they're incredibly climate vulnerable. And if some of the predictions come true about sea level rise in Bangladesh, then the implications of that in terms of refugees and where those refugees will be going, which is towards Dhaka and towards the big urban areas, then there's implications for the whole of society, not just the climate vulnerable poor. And that's where this concept of sort of transformational change and whether we're on the right track in terms of transformational change, I think, comes down to societal notions of adaptive capacity. Does that sort of start to make sense? I'm not sure.
And well, it does in my case, and I also get a number of remarks from people who are still here in the Q&A session that they really appreciate the answers you are giving on that last question. So no, that's perfect. And actually, Vladimir is doing his PhD work on the same topic, so that's where the question came from. I'm going to go for two last questions. I'm going to take them together because we have 8 minutes left. Let me see. The first question, I'll ask both questions to you and then you can answer in the last 8 minutes. The first question is from Tahir, who wonders whether or not there are specific evaluation techniques when you look at adaptive capacities in communities where the illiteracy rate is around 95%. And second question is from Ali, and he asks if you have good examples of evaluating the effectiveness of climate change adaptation measures in very small scale community projects.
There is a paucity of sort of off-the-shelf methods and techniques, and I think there's two reasons for that. Firstly, as we've said, this is a sort of rapidly emerging field, and people really haven't had a chance to develop the thinking. And two, I think certainly from the people such as CARE, who I've been working with, there's a sense that any tools or techniques need to be very context specific. Mm-hmm. So off-the-shelf methods often aren't appropriate. In terms of where I can point people, I noticed that, Dennis, you shared in the last Sea Change weekly email the CARE participatory monitoring and evaluation, reflection and learning manual or report, and I was having a flick through that yesterday. And what is very useful about that report is it does take you through a step-by-step sort of process for developing a participatory M&E sort of system based around notions of adaptive capacity and that sort of thing. That you can, I think, if you download, if you Google search, I'm sure it's available on in the Sea Change library. I've seen a draft of it there, and I think it's available also on the Africa Adapt website. The CARE report, again developed with IED. I think that would be a good starting point to look, and it seemed to me although it's 80 pages long, it's quite easy to read and quite a useful document. I don't know if Julian has anything to add. I'll just hand over.
Yeah, I think in terms of evaluating capacity, for a lot of our work on capacity, not just evaluation of climate change adaptive capacity, but other capacities, we use a framework that was developed in the education sector a few years ago called the Kirkpatrick framework, which looks at how individuals, how knowledge has developed, how that has led to them behaving differently, and how that's then led to them influencing organizational change. And we use those 3 steps as a result chain in a lot of our evaluation of climate change. I think, in terms of tools, the set of tools are fairly well known, and if we go into small communities and down to community level, we can use survey-based approaches, and that doesn't necessarily require literacy, because those are usually administered verbally by an enumerator who will be asking questions. So that really only needs people's understanding. It doesn't need a high level of literacy. And then I think there is still a large place for using the qualitative toolbox, drawing on participatory approaches, focus group discussions, various other things, as well as more sort of ethnographic participant observation approaches to see how people are behaving, what their farming systems are, and helping understand attitudes. So I think there are a whole load of what I would call data collection methods, which could be used at a community level and in small communities and committees with low literacy levels. I think what is important for the evaluator to understand is that that's just a set of data collection tools. What is your analytical framework? What is your experimental approach to the evaluation? So how are you going to identify a counterfactual population? If you're administering those tools in communities who've had some sort of project intervention, can you identify other communities who haven't either yet had the intervention or who won't be having it at all, so that you have the ability to compare understanding, knowledge, attitudes, practices between an in-project community and an outside project community, so that you've got a robust analytical approach. That doesn't, I'm not arguing here for an RCT or necessarily a full statistical approach, but to understand what your counterfactual is in evaluative terms. So I would encourage people to separate out the data collection tools from the larger evaluation design. And I think there are a number of tools that can be used, whatever the design is, that can be used quite suitably in small communities.
And adding to that, the presentation that we just saw and all the documents that have been discussed here will be linked to the recording of this presentation. So if you later on go to the SeaChange website, then you will see the presentation plus all the documents linked to it that have been discussed here. And as said, the CARE manual is called Participatory Monitoring, Evaluation, Reflection and Learning for Community-Based Adaptation, a manual for local practitioners, and it's available from the CARE Climate Change website and also from the SeaChange COP.org network. So there are enough tools and examples out there, but it's true that you can't just pick something off the shelf and project it from one village on the next, but it might give you some good ideas in the development of your own evaluation. Robbie, Julian, I don't know if you have anything to add as last words. Otherwise, I would like to thank everyone for attending.
No, I think, Dennis, we'd just like to thank you very much for facilitating this, for pestering us and making sure that we signed up to a date and that we were available to present. So thank you very much for that and for your facilitation. And also thank you for everyone who's attending. It's, as you said, it's a community of practice, and the community needs everyone to put something in. So thank you to everyone for making it work. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Julian and Robbie, for the presentation and the Q&A. This is the end of this webinar, and we'll send an email to all participants once the webinar becomes available online. Thank you once again, and have a good morning or evening, depending on where you are.